It was mid-afternoon in a quiet, nondescript gym, the kind of place where walls bore the marks of decades of practice. Witnesses remember the moment clearly. Bruce Lee, surrounded on all sides, stood facing multiple trained fighters. In just 15 seconds, the room fell silent. No one moved, no one spoke. And yet everyone understood what had happened. The outcome was absolute. What left them speechless was not a flurry of strikes, nor a display of raw force. It was something far quieter, far more deliberate. Something that settled the challenge before anyone could react, leaving a lasting mark on those who watched. The gym was unremarkable at first glance. Plain concrete walls, a high ceiling with fluorescent lights humming quietly above, and worn mats that had absorbed countless hours of training. Yet for those who arrived that afternoon, there was a subtle weight in the air, a tension that did not announce itself but settled gradually, like a shadow stretching across a room. Every corner, every surface seemed to hold memories of discipline, of challenges fought in silence and observed in patience. A handful of seasoned local fighters were already present, stretching methodically, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the center of the space. A few students and curious onlookers lingered near the edges, speaking in hushed tones, careful not to break the rhythm of the gym. The spectators understood instinctively that something significant was about to unfold, though nothing had yet occurred. Bruce Lee's presence was quiet, unassuming, almost like the calm before a tide moves. He did not draw attention to himself with motion or noise. He simply existed within the space, observing. What defined the room, perhaps more than the people, was its ordinariness. There was nothing grand, nothing staged. No cameras, no elevated platforms, no applause. The environment itself demanded focus. Each fighter could measure his own skill only against the subtle signals of the space, the stiffness of the mats, the echo of footfalls, the shift of weight under balance. In this quiet arena, there were no shortcuts. Reputation meant little. Observation and instinct meant everything. Bruce Lee moved with the same restraint as the environment allowed. Every step, every adjustment of stance was minimal, deliberate. He scanned the space with calm authority, noting the angles of approach, the posture of each challenger, the tension coiled in their muscles. He did not speak. He did not gesture. The room in turn seemed to respond, contracting subtly around him. The fighters sensed it immediately, though none could articulate why. Their presence was acknowledged yet dominated without force. Witnesses would later recall a peculiar stillness. Time felt slightly altered, measured not in seconds but in the pause between actions, in the silent assessment that passed between Bruce Lee and those surrounding him. The ordinary gym had transformed quietly into a stage where skill and observation held the true weight of authority. Nothing had yet happened, and yet the arena itself seemed already aware of what was inevitable. It was in this quiet, unremarkable space that the stage was set. The fighters were ready, but the true measure of control, silent, precise, and absolute, was not yet revealed. The challengers arrived with a quiet confidence, born from years of training and repeated victories in local tournaments. They were not brash, but deliberate in posture and measured in movement. Their eyes studied Bruce Lee carefully, scanning his frame, his stance, the subtle shifts in his weight. Each carried a private calculation: how to approach him, how to test him, how to assert dominance. Yet beneath that confidence there was an unspoken uncertainty, a sense that reputation alone could not be fully measured until the first motion had been exchanged. Bruce Lee did not invite them. He did not position himself as a threat or provoke any challenge. His movements were minimal: a slow adjustment of stance, a subtle turn of the head, a shift of weight that seemed almost inconsequential. Yet these small gestures communicated a presence that the challengers could not ignore. The room itself seemed to bend to his awareness, as though the air had taken note of his calculation and waited. Witnesses recall the psychological interplay more vividly than any physical movement. The challengers, trained and confident, found themselves instinctively testing their own reactions. A tentative step forward would be met with a measured glance. A slight feint in approach was met with subtle repositioning. There was no aggression, no overt display, yet an unspoken boundary had been drawn. Bruce Lee's authority was not declared, it was understood. Each fighter could sense that any attempt to impose force would be anticipated, contained, and neutralized, not with speed alone, but with precision and foresight. It was a quiet test, yet every observer recognized its weight. One could see the mind at work as clearly as the body, the calculations of balance, timing, and distance. The challengers began to hesitate, small micro-pauses in movement, betraying the sudden awareness that Bruce Lee was not merely reacting, he was in control of the situation before it had fully unfolded. Authority had been asserted silently through observation and calculated presence, not through strength or volume. Even among the spectators, a shift occurred. The murmurs diminished. The room contracted around the moment, as if the ordinary gym had dissolved into a chamber of quiet scrutiny. The challengers had arrived with certainty, but by the time Bruce Lee made the smallest adjustment of posture, that certainty had begun to falter. The first moments of the encounter had already rewritten expectations, and the challenge, though still unspoken, had begun to resolve itself. By the time the first tentative gestures were made, Bruce Lee's authority was evident, not as spectacle, not as intimidation, but as inevitability. Every fighter in that gym, regardless of skill or reputation, had come to understand a quiet truth. Mastery could exist without show, and in that calm, deliberate presence, the outcome was already being written. The room, once quiet and expectant, now carried a subtle undercurrent of tension. Small shifts in weight, the brushing of shoes against worn mats, and the faint rustle of clothing became amplified in the awareness of those present. The challengers, once confident, began to measure every step, every glance, every minor motion against the invisible standard Bruce Lee had established. It was not fear, strictly speaking, but a recognition that the equilibrium of the encounter was already tilting. Observers later recounted the delicate pacing of the moment. Each fighter's gestures became more calculated. A hand extended slightly forward would pause, mid-air, as if testing the consequences of that motion. A foot shifted, then withdrew, retracing its path with cautious deliberation. The tension was silent, measured, yet unmistakable. Every participant in the room, from the challengers to the few onlookers pressed against the walls, felt the subtle but undeniable reordering of authority. Bruce Lee did not speak. He did not advance. He did not raise his voice. Yet the space around him contracted as though it had taken shape around his presence. The psychological weight of anticipation began to accumulate. The challengers, trained in combat and confident in their physical abilities, experienced a quiet unease. One could see it in the micro-expressions, the faint tightening of shoulders, a blink held a fraction too long, a subtle hesitation in a step. Witnesses later described the sensation as if the air itself had grown heavier, as if the room had slowed to accommodate the calculation and observation that preceded movement. Bruce Lee's calm focus created a feedback loop. Every tentative gesture by a challenger prompted a measured response, not through contact, but through anticipation and timing. What made the tension remarkable was its restraint. There was no rushing, no spectacle, no frantic testing of strength. Every observer could see that the balance of power was not in the hands of those who sought to assert it, but in the one who had chosen not to. Each pause, each measured breath, reinforced the inevitability of the outcome. The challengers, aware of this silent dominance, began to reconsider not just their physical approach, but their understanding of the encounter itself. By the time the moment reached its apex, the tension had become palpable. It was a stillness charged with expectation, a quiet crescendo that spoke louder than any strike ever could. Witnesses later said that even before the first decisive action, the psychological landscape of the encounter had shifted irrevocably. Authority was not yet exercised through movement, but the mind's surrender had already begun. And in that suspended space, the stage was set for what was to come, a demonstration that would not rely on force or spectacle, but on control, precision, and a clarity of action that left no room for doubt. When the first motion came, it was barely perceptible. A subtle shift of Bruce Lee's weight, almost invisible to the untrained eye, was enough to redirect the space around him. The challengers moved instinctively, reacting not to force but to suggestion, to the imperceptible cues he had embedded in his stance and timing. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense, but a demonstration of mastery executed with precision and restraint. Witnesses described it as quiet, almost imperceptible, hands extended, blocked, or intercepted before they could land. Feet repositioned with exacting efficiency, removing balance from those who thought themselves poised. No strike carried excess motion, no kick sought spectacle. Every action was calculated, economical, designed to resolve the challenge without escalation. The gym, previously filled with murmurs and shifting anticipation, seemed to hold its breath, attuned to each minimal movement. It was the absence of force that astonished the most. Bruce Lee did not need to overpower the challengers. He needed only to demonstrate, to expose the flaws in posture, timing, and expectation. In those 15 seconds, observers could see control exercised not through impact, but through understanding. Each opponent's reaction was anticipated, contained, and subtly redirected. The room no longer held fighters facing each other. It held instruments in a silent symphony of precision. One witness, a senior student who had trained alongside Bruce Lee, recalled that the demonstration resembled a natural law being applied. Like water finding its level, the sequence of movements unfolded with inevitability. No one could resist it, nor could anyone intervene. The challengers did not fall in a dramatic collapse, but they became inert in the face of his quiet authority. Their confidence waned as the precision of Bruce Lee's observation and action became evident. Even among the onlookers, the demonstration carried a palpable lesson. The effect was not just physical, but psychological. It was an exercise in inevitability, the realization that mastery need not shout, need not strike with abandon, that authority can exist in restraint and understanding. In those moments, the room itself seemed to recognize the outcome. Silence did not signal pause, it signaled completion. By the time the 15 seconds had elapsed, the demonstration was complete. The challengers, experienced and confident just moments before, stood still. They were not defeated in a conventional sense. They were made to see the precision and inevitability of true skill. Observers would later describe a long, suspended moment. No words were spoken, yet the lesson resonated, fully. In this quiet, deliberate demonstration, Bruce Lee had transformed a simple gym into a classroom, the challengers into students, and the seconds into a measure of authority that would linger in memory far longer than any physical contest could. The demonstration had ended, though not in the dramatic sense most would expect. There was no shouting, no sudden fall, no outward defeat. Yet among the challengers, something subtle but irrevocable had shifted. Confidence, which had been measured and assured moments before, now faltered. A quiet hesitation had taken hold, growing in proportion to the precision they had just witnessed. The gym, once alive with anticipation, had become a space of suspended comprehension. Witnesses later recalled the first signs of collapse. Small gestures, slight trembling of hands, a retraction of a step, eyes darting as if seeking confirmation, betrayed the challengers' internal recognition of inevitability. They had been confronted not by brute strength, but by the absolute clarity of mastery. Every instinct, every assumption they had brought into the room had been accounted for and quietly neutralized. Bruce Lee did not press the advantage. He allowed their own awareness of their limitations to surface. The psychological shift was cumulative. With each subtle movement, each precise adjustment of posture, the challenger's composure eroded. What had been anticipation became doubt. Doubt became self-consciousness. By the time observers realized what was occurring, the fighters were no longer considering how to test him. They were evaluating themselves. Their focus had turned inward, caught in the gravity of a presence that demanded recognition without force. The onlookers noticed that the collapse was nearly imperceptible to an outsider. There were no dramatic gestures, no physical domination to mark the moment. Instead, it manifested in hesitation, in a slowing of breath, in a measured uncertainty that had replaced the earlier confidence. It was an internal surrender rather than an external one, but no less complete. For those watching, the effect was undeniable. Bruce Lee had established dominance not through confrontation, but through comprehension. This chapter of the encounter revealed something rarely documented in public combat. Mastery, when fully realized, did not rely on spectacle. It relied on the recognition of authority, and the challengers were compelled to acknowledge it silently. They had been tested not by strikes, but by observation, anticipation, and quiet intervention. By the time the 15 seconds had elapsed, they understood, before any motion could be resisted, that the outcome was beyond their control. In those final moments, the gym itself seemed to mirror the psychological state of the challengers, still, attentive, and aware that the demonstration had concluded. Bruce Lee did not celebrate, nor did he comment. The lesson had been internalized. And in that silence, the true weight of mastery became clear. Authority does not always demand action, and surrender is often a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability rather than a result of force. Years later, those who had been present that afternoon would recall the event not as a fight, but as a lesson quietly etched into memory. The gym itself, plain and unremarkable, had retained traces of the encounter. The faint scuff marks on the mats, the subtle shifts in floorboard alignment, and, most of all, the lingering sense of inevitability that had accompanied Bruce Lee's movements. Witnesses described the memory as a measure of time suspended, a moment that refused to fade, not because of spectacle, but because of its clarity and precision. The challengers carried the encounter forward in ways subtle but profound. None spoke loudly of defeat, for there had been no conventional victory to claim. Yet in private practice, in subsequent training sessions, and in conversations among peers, they referenced the quiet authority they had witnessed. It was a standard that could not be taught in classrooms or rehearsed in sparring sessions. It was something observed, understood, and internalized. Bruce Lee's presence that day had transformed their conception of mastery. Over time, stories spread beyond the gym. Students recounted how a small, deliberate shift of weight could unsettle even the most confident fighter. Senior instructors referenced the incident as a quiet benchmark for evaluating authority and efficiency in martial arts. Filmmakers, historians, and enthusiasts pieced together fragments from first-hand accounts, creating a narrative that celebrated not speed, not force, but precise control over environment, body, and mind. The legacy of those 15 seconds became a point of reference in discussions of what mastery truly meant, how decisiveness, observation, and psychological awareness could outweigh sheer power or aggression. For Bruce Lee himself, the event was characteristic of a lifelong approach. He never revisited the gym publicly to boast, nor did he claim the moment as a triumph. The demonstration was complete in its silence, and its impact endured because it was not framed as spectacle. In retrospect, it was less an exhibition of skill than a calibration of presence, a reminder that true mastery leaves no space for doubt, even without a single dramatic gesture. Observers would later describe how the incident quietly influenced training methods, emphasizing adaptability, restraint, and observation over brute technique. What remains most remarkable, decades later, is the absence of exaggeration in retelling. The event's resonance comes not from embellishment but from precision. Witnesses speak of it calmly, almost reverently, noting the subtle shifts of posture, the deliberate economy of motion, and the inevitable collapse of confidence among the challengers. The lesson was not moralized, it was absorbed, and it endures in silence, in the quiet understanding that authority, when exercised with clarity and control, does not need to be shouted, displayed, or dramatized. In the larger context of martial arts history, the encounter stands as a quiet legend. It shaped perceptions, influenced methodology, and reminded generations that mastery is measured not by the noise of the moment, but by the lasting imprint left on those who witness it. The 15 seconds remain a testament to the precision, restraint, and inevitability that define Bruce Lee's approach, an enduring presence that continues to speak in the silence long after the mats have been cleared.